Welcome to Edified, Insights for LDS Women. I'm your host, Melinda Morgan. Edified is a podcast for busy LDS women who are looking for ways to draw closer to the Spirit and deepen their connection with Christ. In a word, this podcast is about connection, our connection with each other, and our connection to God. In today's episode, we are going to be taking a dive into Elder Gary E. Stevenson's talk, Highly Favored of the Lord. Elder Stevenson starts out by talking about his experience when he was a missionary and when President Kimball was going to come to the area, and he and his companion were all excited because they were going to get to go hear the prophet. And then at the last minute, the day before, in fact, they were told that because of the length of the journey and the distance, that they wouldn't be able to go. And he talks about how disappointed he was and how lonely it felt when everybody else got to go and he and his companion didn't. And then he talks about it. It made it worse when they all came back and were talking about it and how they had announced that they were going to have a temple and how he had missed out on that too. And it made me think, and on a very, very, very light level, this idea, this fear of missing out. I know that's a big thing right now. People talk about it all the time. I see it in social media. I hear it. And I was thinking about that. I've had that my whole life. I remember one time I was dating a boy and my boyfriend told me that he was going skiing. So I just assumed, oh, all right, I'll get my stuff and tell what time you picking me up. And, I just assumed. And then a few minutes before he was supposed to pick me up, he called me. And I could tell he was really uncomfortable, but he said this was really just going to be a guy thing. And it was just me and a couple of his friends, and really wasn't going to invite you. and I remember I was so hurt by that. I did not have a level of self-confidence at that time where that didn't bother me, where I could say, oh, okay, that's cool. No problem. No, that fear of missing out on that experience consumed me. And so what I did was I just called another guy, and I had just bought new skis. I had never, ever had never taken them out yet. And so I called this friend of mine and I said, hey, you want to go skiing? And so he and I went up to the same resort where my boyfriend was, and he and I skied. And of course I ran into my boyfriend during the day, and he was so hurt that he knew how excited I was about my new skis, and he was looking forward to going skiing with me the first time I used them. And the fact that I called somebody else and went with them instead, it really hurt his feelings. And I couldn't understand that, because I was like, well, you could have gone with me, but you told me, this was just my fear of missing out really caused an issue there. And you know what, that continued when it came time for my senior prom. I didn't have a boyfriend at that time. The guy that I had been dating was going to the prom with somebody else, and we had been broken up for a few months. And the idea that they were all going and I wasn't, that just wasn't okay with me. I did not have a level of confidence. And so I asked a friend to go, and I ended up buying the tickets, and I ended up doing everything that normally the guy would do, because I just didn't want to miss out on that experience. And I ended up having a miserable time. I mean, it wasn't totally miserable, but it wasn't like a prom was supposed to be. And it certainly didn't live up to my expectations. And so I was remembering those experiences as Elder Stevenson was talking about how lonely he felt, and how hard it was to miss out on something so important. And I can imagine if it had been really important, like missing an opportunity to go hear the prophet, and then to miss something like the temple announcement. I can just imagine. I really felt for him when he shared that part of the story. And then I got to thinking about the people in Lehi's dream who, as they were approaching the tree of life, they saw the great and spacious building. And even some who who made their way to the tree of life and partook of the fruit, when they turned around, they saw the people in this great and spacious building pointing their fingers at them and mocking them. And they were so lured away. They were embarrassed and ashamed. And then they fell away and they made their way to that building. And I've asked myself a few times, what was it in the spacious building that appealed to those people who had partaken of the fruit, but then what they saw that the world had to offer was able to lure them away from it. So I was drawn to the 12th chapter of First Nephi and verse 18, where it says, "And the large and spacious building which thy father saw is vain imaginations and the pride of the children of men." And I thought about that. Okay, what are vain imaginations? And so there's a footnote. I'm using this for those of you who are on the video. I am using this version, which is the study guide version. You can't even tell, it's so worn. But this is the Thomas Valletta edition. And I love the commentaries and that go along with it. And he says, "What are the vain imaginations of men?" I love it when I have a question and I look in the margins and the answer is there. That doesn't happen all the time, but boy, do I love it when it does. It says, "Every day we see allurements of one kind or another that tell us what we have is not enough. Someone or something is forever telling us we need to be more handsome or more wealthy, more applauded or more admired than we see ourselves as being. We are told we haven't collected enough possessions or gone to enough fun places. We are bombarded with the message that on the world scale of things, we have been weighed in the balance and found wanting." That is from Elder Holland in his talk, The Other Prodigal. You might remember that. And I thought about that, and I thought about this lure that the world has on us sometimes that makes us have that fear that we're missing out on something. And so that was one of the thoughts that I had as I just the opening page of Elder Stevenson's talk. And this idea that the world would have us believe that we're missing out on so many things because of our commitment to live to live up to our covenants and to be committed to the gospel. So that was the first thought that I had that I wanted to share with you. But then I kind of pivoted from that, because as he got into the meat of his talk, he talks about the fact that when the pandemic hit, these are people who really missed out. This isn't just, going to the prom. Well, it was going to the prom for some people, but missing out on a ski trip or some of the things of the world. These were important rites of passage for, like, the seniors in high school. They didn't get to graduate, or some people had to cancel weddings, or they had to, when they shut down the temple, they had to postpone receiving their endowments. Even when they started to open in phases, people who were able to go were limited to how many people could go with them. So there's a lot of this missing out that has taken place in the last year, almost year. And even the idea of the funeral and not being able to hold a funeral for somebody that you loved, or go to the hospital and be with somebody who is sick. Those are real examples of this missing out that has taken place in 2020 and even bleeding into 2021. And he said, when the pandemic began to accelerate in 2020, the first presidency pledged that the church and its members will faithfully exhibit our commitment in being good citizens and good neighbors, and will use an abundance of caution. That phrase, abundance of caution, caught my attention. It makes me, the first thing I thought of is, am I using an abundance of caution? What is an abundance of caution? What does that even look like? And then I thought, okay, there's this applies spiritually. Am I using an abundance of caution? And it also applies temporally. And so immediately when I heard the word abundance, or heard that phrase, abundance of caution, I thought of Captain Moroni. If anybody was prepared temporally and spiritually, it was Captain Moroni. I want to go with you to the 49th chapter of Alma, and this is in the middle of the war chapters. I just want to read a couple of verses. I'm just going to skim through a couple of them. As they would prepare and the Lamanites would come against them, they never could quite catch up to Captain Moroni. He was always a step ahead of them. And I love that about them. And it says, being thus prepared, this is the Lamanites, this is verse 7. They supposed that they would easily overpower and subject their brethren to the yoke of bondage, or slay and massacre them according to their pleasure. That was their plan, right? But behold, to their uttermost astonishment, they, Captain Moroni and his people, were prepared for them in a manner which never had been known among the children. They were prepared for the Lamanites to battle after the manner of the instructions of Moroni. And I love that. He used an abundance of caution, right? And I love this. He says, Moroni had altered the management of affairs among the Nephites insomuch that the Lamanites were disappointed in their places of retreat and they could not come upon them. Every strategy that the Lamanites tried, they found that Moroni had gotten there first and had altered things so that the Lamanites were not aware. They weren't used to what they were coming up against with the people of Captain Moroni. But he's like, and this, all of this, the Nephites had all power over their enemies. That phrase right there, they had all power over their enemy. If that enemy is the COVID-19 pandemic, or if that enemy is whatever that enemy is, they had all power over them because of the abundance of caution that they used. And I love in verse 27 when it says, Moroni kept the commandments of God in preparing for the safety of his people. All of this was happening, and the people were experiencing exceedingly great prosperity in the church because of their heed and diligence, which they gave to the word of God. I know there's so much we could say about the story of Captain Moroni and his preparations and his abundance of caution, which we know that he used. That was one of the things that I thought about when I read that phrase in his talk. And then I had this question, what has been our abundance of caution? So now let's look at some of the safeguards that were put in place and their spiritual applications. One of the things that we were asked to do was social distance. So look at the spiritual application of that. Are we putting distance between ourselves and temptation? And how might we do that? Another one was to wear a mask. Boy, don't we love that, right? Won't we all be glad when we don't have to wear the mask anymore? We wear the mask to protect from possibly transmitting airborne sicknesses. That's one of the things they said. It's not so much that you're going to get it, it's that you might transmit it. And so, how do we mask ourselves from saying or doing or transmitting negative thoughts or harmful thoughts or negative attitudes towards others? And we also wear a mask to protect ourselves from breathing in harmful air. So, how do we protect ourselves from taking in harmful content? And that could be on the television, on the news, on social media, whatever the source is. How are we protecting ourselves and safeguarding ourselves? How are we masking ourselves from taking in harmful content? The next one is we quarantined ourselves if we had any symptoms. So how do we quarantine ourselves from symptoms of negativity or bitterness or anger or aggression towards others? And of course, in the last conference message, and I think in the last two, preparation was a huge message, especially in the April one, right? It seemed like almost every talk had something about being physically or temporally and spiritually prepared. But we were told to prepare every needful thing temporally. And so what did we do? Well, we found out that we didn't have toilet paper. We didn't know. We didn't have enough toilet paper. We thought we did, but apparently it became the thing that we needed to search high and low for, and people did. And so, how do we seek out and pay the price to keep our spiritual reservoirs full? That has been the question underscoring everything that happened in 2020 with relationship to being spiritually prepared was there. But the thing that I think struck me the most was the sense of calm that I felt spiritually. And this because I knew that we had a prophet. Now I'm going to come back to that in just a minute because I want to go on to the next point that Elder Stevenson makes. And I think this is really important. He says, We can suffer many afflictions and still be highly favored of the Lord. We read of several examples in the scriptures of those who were able to accomplish greatness in adversity. All of them were defined more by what they were able to do with the Lord's help than by what they could not do as a result of their confinement and restriction. So he starts off with Nephi, and then he talks about Paul being in the prison and how he, even as a prisoner, was able to convert his jailer. He talks about the brothers Nephi and Lehi. He talks about Alma and Amulek and the experience they had in Ammonihah. He talks about Joseph Smith in Liberty Jail. He's like, they all knew what Nephi knew, that although they had seen many afflictions in the course of their days, they were highly favored of the Lord. Okay, the next point that Elder Stevenson makes is that it's the seership of our living prophet that prepared us with adjustments before any hint of a pandemic. And those adjustments are part of what enabled us to endure all the challenges that have come. As Elder Stevenson concludes his talk, he says, brothers and sisters, I believe that one day each of you will look back at the canceled events, the sadness, the disappointments, and the loneliness attendant to the challenging times we are passing through, to see them overshadowed by choice blessings and increased faith and testimonies. There are so many families that suffered so many losses. Are they going to look back at this at some point and have that loss be overshadowed by choice blessings and increased faith and testimonies? Because if people were to ask me, how did you do in 2020 right now, I would go, not so bad. I don't feel like I went through anything hard. And then my husband reminds me, you had cancer. It's like, oh yeah. 2020 started with surgery on my wrists. And because I was in so much pain, I would wake up in the middle of the night and it would take me almost 2 to 3 hours to get the pain to subside before I could go back to sleep. So I was deprived of sleep while I was trying to work. And I was in this tremendous pain. And I had forgotten all that. And so I went and had surgery, and that was awesome. And that surgery went so well and helped out so well that I decided I would go and have the surgery on my neck. And it was in that process where I found out that I had the cancer in the thyroid. And then, of course, then they shut down the hospitals and we couldn't go in and have surgeries unless it was life threatening. So I, went for months with cancer, not knowing if it was spreading. And then I finally had the surgery. And a week later, they called and told me that they didn't get it all, that I needed to go back and have another surgery. And so I did. And then I had the radiation treatment, radioactive iodine. And I don't look at that and say that was an affliction. So I was talking about this with my coworker, Kate. I read that statement to her and I said, what do you think about that? What does that say to you? And she just kind of teared up and she said, in 2020, their father was in assisted living. And when they shut those assisted living cares down, she couldn't see her father. Her father is 93 years old. And she had to go for months without even being able to see him. He couldn't hear. So when she would try to call him, he couldn't communicate with him. And so what she had to do was go drive 3 hours, put a ladder up to his window, climb up the ladder and touch the window. And he would touch the window. And that's the only contact that they had. And just for those few minutes. And then she would drive the 3 hours back home. They did that for months. And then they finally said, we're going to bring him home. And so she, instead of going home after work every night and to her home, she would go to her father's home and stay there so that he wasn't alone, because he needed the assisted care. And so she did that for months. He did pass away in November. He passed away on Thanksgiving Day. During this year, besides all that was going on with her father, her sister had a surgery and then had a complication related to the surgery and ended up in ICU because her spine was leaking and they thought they were going to lose her. Then her niece ends up in ICU. She had collapsed in her apartment and was found on the floor unresponsive. And it turns out that she had this tumor. Oh my heavens. I don't even know all the things that went on with that. I just know that she was there for a long time and is now recovering. And then she finds out that her daughter has a rare form of cancer. And to top all of this off, the dog died unexpectedly. Can't explain it. The stomach had flipped. It doesn't happen that often, but they don't have an explanation for how it happened. And in his case, they just couldn't save him. And then she said, but listen to this. She's like, my son-in-law applied for job after job after job. He had graduated from college and was trying to get a job. And he was turned down and turned down and turned down. And she said, but when they found out that her daughter had cancer, it turns out that they live in the city where one of 3 doctors who specialize in that form of cancer resides and practices. When they brought her dad home, because he was home, Kate was able to hold his hand while he was dying. And she said during that time, they felt the reality of the veil and how thin that it can be at times. And she said she felt her mother's presence there. Her mother had passed away many years ago, and they felt her. She said that was one of the most tender, spiritual, sacred experiences that she's ever had. And then she said about her niece, her dad, who lives 3 hours away, he just happened to be up north that day and had tried to call his daughter and couldn't get a hold of her. He had just decided, I'll just go home. She's obviously not available. And something told him just go over there. And so when he went over there, he's the one who found her unconscious on the floor. She looks at that and she says, all these things were happening in our family. And yet all these little tender mercies and these little miracles were there. And she said, I will look back at this time and I will see that all those challenging times were overshadowed by the blessings and by our increased faith and testimony. All right, you guys, I want to close by going to section 128 of the Doctrine and Covenants. I love these verses because they're verses about gladness. And I think we all want and can use a little more of that, right? Just to remember all that we have to be glad about. Starting in verse 19, he's like, now what do we hear in the gospel which we have received? A voice of gladness, a voice of mercy from heaven, and a voice of truth out of earth, glad tidings for the dead, a voice of gladness for the living and the dead, glad tidings of great joy. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of those that bring glad tidings of good things, and that say unto Zion, behold, thy God reigneth. And then skip over to verse 22. Brethren, shall we not go on in so great a cause? Go forward and not backward. Courage, brethren, and on to the victory. Let your hearts rejoice and be exceedingly glad. I am grateful that because of the gospel of Jesus Christ, we are highly favored of the Lord. Okay, you guys, let's talk about this week's Do One Thing invitation. Oh my goodness. Where do we even begin? Maybe we begin by looking at the ways that we are highly favored, each one of us personally. And you've probably been doing this all through the year. But take a moment this week and just go back through the year and think about what blessings came as you were going through the struggles that you went through. And what blessings do you see in the lives of others? And together, let's just raise a voice of gladness. Let's shout it from the rooftops. Let's post it on social media. Let's sing it in praises. Let's say it in sacred prayer. All those things that we have and all those reasons that we have to be glad, and all the ways that we are truly highly favored of the Lord. All right, you guys, that's it for this week. I hope that you're feeling uplifted and edified. And I hope if you feel so inclined that you will share this episode with a friend or a family member. And to everyone that has left me a review in iTunes, thank you so much. Those reviews do so much to help spread the word and get the message of the podcast out there. So from the bottom of my heart, I thank you. Have a great week, everyone. Until next time.